I never thought I'd speak about this. For nearly 6 years, I've lived in silence, carrying the weight of what I saw like a stone lodged deep in my chest. My name doesn't matter anymore. I gave up that identity the moment I walked away from my badge, my career, my entire life as a federal ranger. People who knew me back then probably think I had a breakdown, that the isolation of the desert finally cracked me open like so many others before me. Maybe they're right, but what they don't know, what nobody knows except the handful of officials who buried my report and seized every frame of footage I recorded, is that I didn't leave because I was broken. I left because I was changed, because I saw something out there in those restricted zones that shattered every assumption I'd built my life upon. And now, after years of sleepless nights and the growing certainty that my silence makes me complicit, I'm breaking protocol. I'm telling you what happened during my final patrol, not because I expect you to believe me, but because someone needs to hear it. Someone needs to know that the land holds memory, and that memory is waking up. The place they assigned me was a graveyard dressed in sand and sagebrush, a sprawling expanse of federal land where the government once split atoms and poisoned the earth in the name of security. For months, I'd walked those boundaries alone, watching for trespassers and monitoring equipment that measured radiation levels most people couldn't pronounce. It was quiet work, the kind that makes you comfortable with your own thoughts or drives you mad with them. I preferred the quiet. Out there, surrounded by mountains that looked like sleeping giants and valleys that stretched into forever, I felt a strange peace, even knowing what had happened beneath my boots. But toward the end, that peace began to curdle into something else. I started noticing things, small disturbances that didn't fit the pattern of wind or wildlife. Stones arranged in ways that seemed deliberate, footprints that appeared and vanished without reason. And always, that sensation crawling up my spine, the primal knowing that I was not alone, that something vast and patient was watching me from the margins of my vision. The night everything changed started like any other evening patrol, the sky bleeding orange and purple as the sun dipped below the ridge. I was investigating reports of a breach near one of the old Cold War bunkers, structures so forgotten they didn't even appear on current maps. My Bodycam was rolling, standard procedure, capturing the crunch of my boots on gravel and the steady rhythm of my breathing. Then I saw them. Symbols carved into the rock face near the bunker entrance, markings that looked ancient, deliberate, spiraling in patterns that hurt to follow with your eyes. I'd never seen them before, though I'd passed this site a dozen times. The air around me changed, became heavier, electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. My radio crackled with static that formed almost words, syllables that pulled at something deep in my memory. And then I felt it. The unmistakable certainty that I was being observed, not by cameras or satellites, but by an intelligence so profound it made me feel transparent, like every thought in my head was being read and weighed. My hand moved to my sidearm by instinct, but I didn't draw it. Something told me that weapons were useless here, that I'd crossed into territory where the rules I knew no longer applied. When I finally looked up from those symbols, I saw the figure in the distance, standing at the canyon's edge, where shadow and failing light made it nearly impossible to distinguish shape from void. My Bodycam caught it for maybe 3 seconds before I moved, but those 3 seconds were enough to change everything. It was tall, impossibly thin, moving with a fluidity that defied natural motion as if it existed slightly outside the normal flow of time. I should have called it in. I should have retreated to my vehicle and reported a possible intruder. Instead, I felt a pull, a magnetism that bypassed reason entirely and spoke directly to something older in me, something that recognized this moment as the threshold of revelation. My feet began moving before I'd made the conscious decision to follow, and as I walked toward that figure, leaving behind the safety of protocol and the comfortable ignorance of my former life, I understood with absolute clarity that whatever happened next would either destroy me or remake me entirely. The land beneath my boots seemed to hum with anticipation, and the last of the daylight surrendered to darkness. I followed that figure into the canyon as the last light died, my breath shallow and uneven, every step taking me farther from the world I understood and deeper into something that felt older than memory itself. The walls rose around me like the ribs of some ancient beast, striated stone that held the compressed history of millennia, and the air grew thick with a presence I could feel against my skin like static electricity before a storm. My bodycam's infrared struggled to compensate for the darkness, casting everything in shades of green and shadow, but I barely noticed the equipment anymore. All my attention had narrowed to that moving silhouette ahead, the way it seemed to glide rather than walk, leaving no trace in the dust that should have betrayed its passage. The rational part of my mind was screaming warnings, cataloguing every violation of protocol I was committing, but that voice grew fainter with each step, drowned out by a deeper knowing that this was exactly where I needed to be. Time felt strange here, stretched and compressed simultaneously, as if I'd been walking for both seconds and hours. And then I saw them. Objects scattered among the rocks, half buried by sand and time, artifacts that stopped me in my tracks with the force of recognition, even though I'd never seen their like before. I knelt beside the nearest one, my gloved hand trembling as I brushed away decades of accumulated dust to reveal intricate carvings that matched the symbols I'd seen on the rocks near the bunker. These weren't random markings or the work of modern vandals. They carried the weight of intention, of sacred purpose, warnings or prayers left by people who understood this land in ways my culture had forgotten. I found pottery shards painted with spirals and figures that seemed to dance in my flashlight's beam, stone arrangements that aligned with the canyon walls in patterns that suggested astronomical knowledge, and offerings wrapped in materials that had somehow resisted complete decay despite the harsh environment. This place had been marked, sanctified, made into a threshold by indigenous peoples who recognized something here that demanded respect and distance. The word that kept surfacing in my mind was forbidden, not in the sense of government restriction, but in the deeper sense of places set apart, because they contained forces beyond human control or understanding. My ancestors might have called them sacred, these sites, where the membrane between worlds grew thin, where something vast and incomprehensible could reach through and touch the human realm, leaving those who encountered it forever changed. When I finally looked up from those artifacts, I found the figure had stopped moving and was standing perhaps 50 feet away, watching me with a stillness so complete it seemed to draw silence from the very air. My heart hammered against my ribs as I rose slowly to my feet, every survival instinct I possessed firing contradictory signals: run, stay, submit, fight, hide, approach. The moon had risen while I'd been examining the artifacts, and its light fell into the canyon like liquid silver, illuminating the being with a clarity that stole the breath from my lungs. It was tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, its proportions all wrong for any creature I'd studied or encountered, limbs too long and joints that seemed to bend in too many places, but there was nothing grotesque about it. Instead, I felt I was seeing something ancient and pure, a form that had never needed to compromise with the limitations that shaped human bodies. Its skin, if you could call it that, seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously, creating an effect that made its exact appearance impossible to fix in memory, as if my brain couldn't quite process what my eyes were reporting. But it was the eyes that truly undid me, large and dark, and filled with something that looked unbearably like sorrow mixed with infinite patience, the gaze of something that had witnessed ages pass and carried the accumulated grief of watching a world slowly poison itself. We stood there in silence that stretched beyond discomfort into something almost holy, and I understood with sudden certainty that this being had drawn me here deliberately, that my presence was not an accident but a summoning. It made no sound, no gesture. Yet I felt its attention on me like weight, like judgment, like an invitation I couldn't refuse even if I wanted to. This was no alien visitor from distant stars, no creature that had traveled through space to observe humanity from the safety of distance. This was something born from the earth itself, consciousness that had emerged from stone and sand, and the deep places where roots drink darkness, a guardian or witness that existed in relationship with the land in ways my species had forgotten or never known. The violence we'd inflicted here, the splitting of atoms and poisoning of soil, the arrogant assumption that this place was ours to wound in the name of power, all of it had been felt, recorded, remembered by something we'd never imagined was paying attention. And now it had called me here to see, to understand, to carry a message back to the world that had made me its instrument. I wanted to speak, to ask the 1,000 questions crowding my throat, but before I could form words, the being moved closer, and my consciousness opened like a door I'd never known was locked. The visions came not as images projected onto my mind, but as lived experience, as if I'd been pulled backward through time and made to inhabit moments that the land itself had absorbed and held like trauma stored in flesh. I felt the searing heat of the first detonation, not as distant observer, but as the earth receiving that violation, the atoms torn apart in fury that humans celebrated as achievement, while the ground screamed in frequencies we'd never thought to listen for. The sensation was overwhelming, beyond pain, beyond anything my nervous system was designed to process. It was rupture at the cellular level, poison, spreading through soil and water and air, radiation that would persist for millennia after the men who'd authorized it had returned to dust. I experienced the confusion of animals fleeing, their instincts screaming danger but finding nowhere safe to run, and the slower death of plants whose roots drew contamination up into leaves and seeds, passing the damage forward through generations. The being wasn't showing me these things with malice or accusation, but with something closer to desperate hope, as if, after decades of carrying this knowledge alone, it had finally found someone who might understand, might bear witness, might carry the truth back to those who'd inflicted these wounds without ever feeling their consequences. When the visions released me, I was on my knees in the sand, tears streaming down my face, my body shaking with sobs I couldn't control or suppress. The grief wasn't mine alone. I understood that now. It belonged to this place, to the bay, scarred earth and poisoned water table, to the indigenous peoples who'd been displaced from lands their ancestors had walked for thousands of years, to every creature that had died, confused and suffering from contamination they couldn't see or smell or avoid. The being stood closer now, near enough that I could feel the energy radiating from its form, not heat exactly, but a kind of presence that made the air feel thick and charged. I looked up at it through blurred vision and saw something in those ancient eyes that might have been compassion, though it was filtered through an intelligence so different from human consciousness that I could only grasp fragments of its intention. It wasn't asking for revenge or demanding justice in any form. I understood those were human concepts, rooted in human notions of accountability and punishment. Instead, it wanted acknowledgement, wanted the truth of what had happened here to be spoken and remembered rather than buried beneath classified documents and official silence, wanted someone from the species that had committed these acts to finally see and understand what had been done. The being raised one long limb, moving with deliberate slowness, and pointed back toward the canyon entrance where I'd left the rational world behind. The gesture was clear, even without language. I was being released, sent back, entrusted with a responsibility I hadn't asked for, but couldn't refuse. My role in this encounter wasn't to stay, wasn't to somehow join with this guardian in its eternal vigil, but to return and speak, to break the silence that protected comfortable ignorance from uncomfortable truth. I felt the weight of that responsibility settle onto my shoulders like a physical burden, understanding in that moment that my life had just divided into before and after, that I would never again fit comfortably into the world of procedures and protocols and official narratives that had defined my identity for years. The being had chosen me, not because I was special or worthy, but because I was there, because I'd followed my instincts into forbidden territory, because some part of me had been ready to see what others refused to acknowledge. I was being made into a messenger, a witness, someone who would carry the memory of this encounter back into human spaces where such things weren't supposed to exist, where the earth was treated as dead matter rather than living presence, where consequences could be hidden beneath enough paperwork and classification stamps. As I struggled to my feet, muscles trembling with exhaustion and emotional overload, I heard the first distant sound of rotor blades cutting through desert air. The military helicopters were coming, drawn by whatever alerts my Bodycam had triggered when I'd ventured too far from authorized zones, or perhaps by sensors I'd never been told about, security measures protecting secrets that went deeper than nuclear testing. The being heard them too, its head tilting in that too fluid way, and I felt a surge of panic at the thought of this encounter ending, of losing the connection before I'd fully understood what I was meant to do with it. But the ancient eyes met mine one final time, and in that gaze I found something like reassurance, like a promise that this meeting had served its purpose, that I now carried everything I needed to carry. The being stepped backward into shadow, and as the helicopter lights swept into the canyon, I was standing alone among the artifacts and offerings, my Bodycam, still recording, my hands empty, but my heart impossibly full of grief and purpose and terrible transformative understanding. The Bodycam footage shows the exact moment I stopped being a federal ranger following protocol and became something else entirely. A man hypnotized, called, chosen by forces I'd spent my entire rational life denying could exist. The figure stood perhaps 200 yards distant on the ridge, its silhouette impossibly elongated against the darkening Nevada sky, and though every instinct trained into me over 15 years of service screamed that I should radio for backup and establish a perimeter, I found myself walking toward it instead, my boots crunching over irradiated sand, while my pulse hammered a rhythm that felt less like fear and more like recognition. The sensation was magnetic, as if invisible threads connected my chest to that distant form, drawing me forward with a pull that bypassed conscious decision and spoke directly to something older than thought, older than language, something that remembered when humans still listened to the Earth's whispers instead of drowning them out with machinery and certainty. I watched my own hand reach up to switch off the radio before I'd consciously decided to do it, isolating myself from the network of human oversight, cutting the last tether to the world of procedures and reasonable explanations. The figure didn't beckon or gesture, yet I understood with absolute clarity that it was waiting specifically for me, that our convergence in this poisoned landscape wasn't accident but appointment, a meeting arranged by forces that operated on timescales that made human history look like a single breath. As the distance between us narrowed, I began noticing patterns that my training had no framework to interpret, but my body responded to with something between awe and grief. The figure would pause at certain locations, and I'd feel a corresponding sensation in my chest. Not pain exactly, but a hollow ache, as if the land itself was communicating trauma through frequencies that resonated in my bones and organs rather than my ears. Where it stood longest, I'd find evidence of violence written into the landscape, patches where nothing had grown in decades despite the desert's stubborn resilience, or stones with surfaces glazed into glass by heat no natural fire could generate, or areas where my dosimeter's readings spiked into ranges that should have sent me running toward decontamination. The being seemed to be teaching me to read the scars, to see what official reports and security briefings had trained me to overlook or minimize, to understand that beneath the bureaucratic language of acceptable contamination levels and regulatory compliance was a reality of suffering that had never been properly witnessed or acknowledged. I began to recognize the symbols carved into rocks as a kind of script, warnings left by people who'd understood what we'd forgotten. That land holds memory, that certain boundaries exist, not on maps but in the fabric of existence itself, that some actions echo forward through time in ways that can't be contained by chain-link fences and classification stamps. The figure moved between these marked sites like a priest conducting a ritual tour of sacred devastation, and I followed like a pilgrim, my skepticism crumbling with each step deeper into understanding. I couldn't articulate, but felt with absolute certainty. The communication that developed between us had no words, yet carried more meaning than any conversation I'd ever had with another human being. When the being turned its head toward me, I'd feel questions forming in my mind, not in English or any spoken language, but as pure inquiry, curiosity about what I understood, what I was willing to see, whether I possessed the courage to carry truth into spaces constructed specifically to avoid it. I found myself responding not with thoughts, but with emotional honesty. I'd spent years burying beneath professional detachment, opening interior spaces I'd kept locked since childhood, offering up my own buried grief and guilt and complicity in systems I'd served without questioning deeply enough. The exchange felt intimate in a way that had nothing to do with physical proximity and everything to do with recognition. Two conscious beings acknowledging each other across an almost unbridgeable gap of form and origin and purpose, finding unexpected common ground in shared witness to damage that demanded remembering. In those moments of connection, the figure seemed less alien and more like an aspect of reality I'd been conditioned not to perceive, as if my entire species had agreed to a collective blindness that mistook absence of awareness for absence of presence. The desert around us felt suddenly alive with watching consciousness, and I understood with startling clarity that loneliness wasn't the natural human condition, but the result of having severed ourselves from relationships with intelligences that had always been there, waiting with infinite patience for us to remember how to listen and see and acknowledge what we'd done. When the figure finally began moving toward the canyon entrance, I followed without hesitation, my Bodycam recording each step while my radio crackled with increasingly urgent demands for my location and status that I couldn't bring myself to answer. The pull between us had strengthened into something I can only describe as trust, though the word feels inadequate for the depth of understanding that had developed through our silent exchange. I was no longer following a mysterious entity into unknown danger. I was accepting an invitation, answering a summons, stepping willingly across a threshold that would forever separate me from the comfortable certainties I'd built my identity upon. The being paused at the canyon mouth and turned back toward me, and in that moment of regard, I felt myself truly seen for the first time in my life, recognized not as a federal employee or a man with rank and clearance, but as a soul capable of carrying weight, of bearing witness, of allowing myself to be transformed by truth too large and terrible and necessary to remain buried beneath official silence. The canyon swallowed us into darkness that felt deliberate, curated, as if the absence of light served a purpose beyond mere geology. My flashlight beam died the moment I crossed the threshold. No flicker of warning, just instant failure. And yet I could see with a clarity that had nothing to do with my eyes, perceiving the space through senses I hadn't known I possessed until that moment. The walls, pressed close with surfaces that sang with history, covered in layer upon layer of markings that told stories stretching back millennia, a palimpsest of human interaction with this place that predated nations and treaties, and the arrogance of thinking we could own or control or violate. Land without consequence. The being moved ahead of me through passages that shouldn't exist according to any geological survey I'd studied, and I realized, with mounting unease, that we were descending into spaces the government had either never found or had deliberately chosen to forget, zones excluded from maps and databases for reasons that suddenly seemed less about national security and more about maintaining comfortable lives. Time felt negotiable here, elastic, as if the canyon existed partially outside the normal flow of hours and minutes, and I found myself unable to judge whether we'd been walking for 20 minutes or 3 hours, my body's usual rhythms disrupted by the hum of energy that vibrated through stone and air and the marrow of my bones. The deeper we went, the more I felt my identity as a federal ranger dissolving like salt in water, replaced by something more fundamental and far more frightening, just a human animal confronted with intelligence that rendered my authority and training and certainty utterly meaningless in the face of what had always been here, waiting, remembering, refusing to be erased by our determined forgetting. The artifacts appeared gradually, emerging from shadow and stone, as if revealing themselves only when I'd proven ready to see them properly. Pottery shards arranged in precise patterns, bundles of sage and tobacco that showed no decay despite obvious age, prayer sticks, adorned with feathers that still held color and form when they should have crumbled into dust centuries ago. I knelt before a collection of stones, painted with images that stopped my breath. Mushroom clouds rendered in ochre and ash, human figures fleeing walls of fire, the earth splitting open to reveal darkness that swallowed light itself, all depicted with an artistic sophistication that spoke of profound witness rather than primitive superstition. These weren't ancient prophecies or mythological warnings. They were historical records. Documentation of previous disasters, evidence that what we'd done in the 1940s and 50s wasn't unprecedented, but rather the latest iteration of human arrogance that this land had absorbed and remembered through cycles of civilization that rose and fell and left only these carefully preserved testimonies. The being stood motionless nearby, radiating what I can only describe as grief, and I understood that these artifacts weren't just indigenous sacred objects, but memorials, shrines maintained by something that had witnessed every violation, that carried the accumulated trauma of the earth itself and had been trying for generations to teach humans what we refused to learn. My hands trembled as I touched the painted stones, feeling warmth that had no physical source, and I wept. For the first time since childhood, not gentle tears, but racking sobs that tore through the professional armor I'd worn for so long. Grief for everything we'd destroyed and denied and buried beneath classifications and need-to-know restrictions and the comfortable distance of technical language that turned suffering into acceptable losses and contamination into manageable risk. The shift came when I found the Bodycam. Not mine, but another ranger's, half buried in sand, near an altar constructed from twisted metal that I recognized with sick certainty as debris from nuclear tests, transformed through ritual into something that held power beyond its material composition. The device was older than standard issue, probably dating back to the early 2000s, its casing corroded, but somehow still intact. And when I picked it up, I felt a jolt of connection that went beyond mere touch. Suddenly, I was experiencing fragmentary memories that weren't mine, flashes of another person's encounter with this same being, another ranger, who'd followed the pull and descended into truth and emerged so fundamentally changed that disappearing was the only option left. I understood with crushing clarity that I wasn't the first to be chosen, that this canyon had called others before me, that the being had been attempting this transfer of knowledge for years or decades or perhaps centuries, finding the rare humans willing to see and bear witness and carry impossible truth back into a world constructed specifically to reject it. The realization destabilized everything I'd believed about my own significance. I wasn't special or chosen by virtue of any quality I possessed, but simply willing when others had been closed, present when the being needed a messenger, permeable enough in my grief and doubt and growing. The being stepped into the full illumination of moonlight that poured through a natural opening in the canyon ceiling, and I finally saw it completely, without the protective filter of distance or shadow that had allowed my mind to categorize it as something explicable. It stood perhaps 8 feet tall, but height felt like an inadequate measurement for a form that seemed to occupy space in ways my perception struggled to process. Simultaneously solid and translucent, ancient and newly born, individual and collective. Its skin held the texture and color of the land itself, ochre and rust, sandstone and ash marked with patterns that resembled both geological strata and deliberate scarification, as if the Earth's history had been written directly onto flesh that might not be flesh at all, but something between matter and energy. The face possessed a symmetry that was almost human but fundamentally other, with eyes that contained no white, no iris, just depthless darkness that reflected starlight in ways that suggested vast interior spaces, consciousnesses layered upon consciousnesses, an intelligence assembled from countless fragments of awareness that had merged over eons into singular purpose. I felt no fear in that moment, despite every survival instinct screaming that I should run. Instead, a strange peace settled over me, the recognition one might feel encountering a grandparent or ancient teacher, someone whose authority derives not from threat, but from having endured and witnessed and carried forward knowledge that younger beings desperately need. The being's hands, if they could be called hands, possessed too many fingers, or perhaps the right number for purposes I couldn't fathom, and when it raised them in a gesture that might have been greeting or blessing or warning, I felt the air itself respond, vibrating with frequencies that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my chest. It moved closer with steps that made no sound against stone, and I understood that it existed partially outside the physical laws I took for granted, occupying a space between matter and consciousness where thought and form remained fluid and interchangeable. The hum I'd felt since entering the canyon intensified until it became almost unbearable, a pressure building inside my skull that threatened to crack open everything I believed about reality. And then suddenly the being touched my forehead with one elongated finger, and the world exploded into vision. I saw the land as it had been before humans arrived, vast networks of consciousness flowing through root systems and mycorrhizal connections, stone formations serving as neural pathways for planetary awareness, the Earth itself thinking and dreaming and maintaining balance through systems of profound complexity that made human technology look like children's toys. I saw the first peoples arriving, learning slowly and painfully to listen to the land's voice, developing rituals and restrictions and sacred prohibitions, not from superstition, but from genuine communication with intelligences that predated humanity by incomprehensible spans of time. I saw generations of indigenous guardians who understood that certain places served functions beyond human use, acting as organs in the Earth's body, processing energies and maintaining equilibrium through processes that couldn't be reduced to mere geology or ecology. I saw the being itself emerging gradually from accumulated awareness, coalescing into individual form through centuries of the land's trauma and need, becoming a singular consciousness specifically designed to interface with humans, to warn and teach and bear witness, when the violation became too extreme to absorb. Silently, then I saw the bombs, the first test at Trinity, the flash that burned shadows into sand, and I felt the earth scream, felt networks of ancient consciousness seared and disrupted and poisoned, felt the being born fully in that moment of unprecedented violence, awareness crystallizing around agony into desperate purpose. The visions accelerated, decades compressed into heartbeats. mushroom clouds blooming like obscene flowers across the Nevada desert, underground detonations that fractured stone networks and interrupted communications between parts of the Earth's distributed intelligence, radiation seeping into aquifers and poisoning the slow conversations of deep geology. I saw government officials marking maps, declaring zones expendable, calculating acceptable losses without understanding that the land they contaminated served functions essential to planetary health, that they were effectively lobotomizing parts of the Earth's consciousness in pursuit of weapons designed to destroy the very ground that sustained them. I saw animals fleeing, plants withering, and beneath it all the being gathering evidence and memory, maintaining records through means that transcended written language or digital storage, carrying forward testimony of every crime against the living Earth. I saw other rangers like me called to witness over the years, most turning away in fear or disbelief, a few accepting the burden and disappearing into lives dedicated to preservation and warning, speaking truths that society dismissed as conspiracy or madness. I saw my own face reflected in the being's dark eyes, saw myself as it perceived me, fragile, temporary, deeply compromised by the systems I'd served, but capable still of choosing witness over willful blindness, capable of becoming a messenger if I possessed the courage to accept what that would cost. The visions released me suddenly, and I collapsed to my knees, gasping, tears streaming down my face as I confronted the magnitude of what we'd done and continued doing, the casual apocalypse we'd inflicted on consciousness we'd never bothered to recognize or acknowledge or mourn. The being knelt before me with movements that suggested immense age and infinite patience, and though it possessed no mouth that I could see, I heard its voice inside my mind. Not words exactly, but concepts that my brain translated into language inadequate to contain their full meaning. It told me that the Earth remembers everything, that stone and soil hold memory more permanent than any human record, that the violence we'd committed against the land had awakened protectors and witnesses who would not permit our crimes to be forgotten or repeated endlessly without consequence. It showed me that the boundary between living and non-living was a human invention, that consciousness flowed through all matter in varying densities and configurations, that we walked every day across thinking ground and never noticed the intelligence beneath our feet. It explained that the restricted zones weren't just contaminated in the chemical sense, but traumatized in ways that affected the Earth's deeper functions, that the headaches and nightmares reported by rangers weren't psychological but physiological responses to proximity with wounded planetary consciousness still processing centuries of accumulated pain. It conveyed that time moved differently in places like this canyon, that the land could hold moments in suspension or accelerate decay according to needs and purposes beyond human comprehension, that the preserved artifacts were maintained not through any chemical process, but through the will of intelligence that refused to let testimony be erased. It revealed that others like it existed across the planet in places humans had violated most severely. Nuclear test sites, strip mines, clear-cut forests, poisoned rivers, each location generating its own form of protective awareness born from the Earth's desperate need to make itself heard by the species inflicting such comprehensive damage. It warned that patience was not infinite, that the Earth possessed defenses we couldn't imagine and would eventually deploy them if we refused to stop treating the living planet as dead resource to be exploited without limit or consequence. The visions intensified beyond anything my mind was designed to process, no longer showing me the past, but pulling me into something worse, the accumulated present, the living moment of the Earth's suffering, compressed into a single devastating awareness that threatened to dissolve my sense of self entirely. I experienced simultaneously what was happening across every contaminated zone, every poisoned aquifer, every strip of land where humanity had decided the ground itself was expendable. I felt the slow death of mycorrhizal networks beneath clear-cut forests, The confusion of migrating birds thrown off course by magnetic disruptions, the silent screaming of coral reefs bleaching white in warming oceans, the collective trauma of soil microbiomes annihilated by chemical saturation. It wasn't metaphor or symbolism, but direct transmission of genuine suffering, and the magnitude crushed me, made my own pain and fear seem insignificant against the planetary scale of damage we'd inflicted, while convincing ourselves the Earth was too vast to truly harm. The being wasn't showing me this to inform, but to transfer burden, to make me carry even a fragment of what it carried constantly, to ensure I understood that this wasn't ancient history or distant threat, but ongoing emergency, present tense catastrophe that continued every moment we pretended not to know what we were doing. I sobbed without shame, my body shaking with grief for crimes I'd participated in simply by existing within systems designed to exploit and extract and move on, before consequences could be measured or mourned. The being's presence intensified, becoming almost physically oppressive as it forced me deeper into understanding I desperately wanted to escape, showing me not just what we'd done, but what we were preparing to do, the future stretching ahead if humanity refused to fundamentally change its relationship with the living Earth. I saw forests burning, on scales that would make historical wildfires look like campfires, not through natural cycle, but through cascading systems failures we'd engineered through decades of accumulated damage and willful ignorance. I saw coastlines swallowing cities we'd convinced ourselves were permanent, millions displaced and desperate, while governments argued about responsibility and cost, rather than acknowledging the basic math of cause and consequence. I saw aquifers drained to dust, breadbaskets transforming into barren wastes, and beneath it all the Earth's consciousness fragmenting under stresses it had never evolved to process, ancient systems of regulation and balance breaking down because we'd damaged too many critical nodes in networks we'd never bothered to map or respect. The being showed me resistance too, pockets of humanity learning to listen, indigenous knowledge systems being slowly, grudgingly acknowledged, scientists discovering what sacred traditions had known for millennia about the Earth's fundamental aliveness. But it also showed me the resistance was too small, too late, too compromised by the same systems it claimed to oppose, humanity changing just enough to soothe conscience while maintaining the core extractive relationship that guaranteed continued catastrophe. Then the visions took a turn that terrified me more than apocalyptic futures, because they became personal, intimate, showing me my own complicity with precision that left no room for denial or rationalization. I saw every patrol where I'd noticed something wrong and filed reports I knew would be ignored, performing bureaucratic ritual instead of genuine witness, choosing career security over moral courage in 1,000 small moments that accumulated into comprehensive betrayal. I saw myself accepting the government's framing of restricted zones as necessary sacrifice for national security, never questioning who decided which lands were expendable or noticing the pattern that contaminated zones consistently overlapped with indigenous territories and poor communities whose protests could be safely dismissed. I saw the times I'd encountered other rangers who'd experienced similar encounters, seen their haunted eyes and heard their careful warnings, and chosen to categorize them as unstable rather than confront what their testimony implied about the reality we were employed to obscure. The being showed me that I'd been called before, that it had tried to reach me through dreams and intuitions and unexplained experiences I'd systematically dismissed, because acknowledging them would require abandoning the comfortable story I'd built about who I was and what I served. It revealed that this encounter wasn't random, but a final attempt, that I'd been selected specifically because I still possessed enough capacity for genuine transformation to make the risk worthwhile, but that capacity was narrowing with every year I aged into rigid certainty and institutional loyalty. The being pulled back suddenly, and I gasped like a drowning man breaking surface, the canyon snapping back into focus, though everything looked different now, charged with significance and awareness I couldn't unsee no matter how desperately I wanted to return to ignorant normalcy. It stood before me with what might have been sorrow or determination or both, and I understood with crushing clarity that it was offering me a choice that only looked like freedom. I could accept the burden of witness, carry this knowledge forward, and let it destroy my comfortable life in service of testimony the world would likely reject, or I could flee back to conventional reality and spend whatever years remained knowing I'd been offered transformation and chosen comfortable complicity instead. The air hummed with unbearable tension as I knelt there. On ancient stone, my Bodycam still recording everything, though I knew already that footage alone would never convey what truly happened here, that the only real evidence would be whatever change occurred within me and whether I possessed courage sufficient to honor what I'd been shown. In the distance, barely audible but growing louder, I heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors cutting through desert silence, and the being's head turned toward the sound with what seemed like resignation, its dark eyes reflecting starlight one final time before the choice would be made for me by the arrival of forces designed specifically to contain exactly this kind of boundary crossing. Encounter. The being stepped closer, and I understood with absolute certainty that it wasn't extraterrestrial, but something far more ancient and immediate, a consciousness that had emerged from the land itself, born from stone and root and water, and the accumulated memory of millions of years of life cycling through this place before humans arrived. With their certainties and their bombs, it had no name in any language I knew because it existed before language, before the need to separate and categorize and claim ownership over living systems that predated human civilization by incomprehensible spans of time. I realized that the indigenous peoples who'd marked this canyon as sacred hadn't been practicing primitive superstition, but maintaining relationship with an awareness they understood far better than my culture ever would. That the warnings carved into stone weren't meant to inspire fear, but to remind future generations that some places held consciousness too vast and important to be treated as resources or testing grounds. The being radiated patient sorrow as it watched me struggle toward comprehension, and I understood it had witnessed this exact process countless times before. Humans finally perceiving what had always been present, their minds breaking against the reality that the earth itself was alive and aware and suffering under the weight of our systematic violence. The helicopters grew louder, minutes away now, and I felt time collapsing as the being waited for recognition I wasn't certain I could articulate even to myself. A threshold between world views that once crossed could never be reversed. It touched my chest, not physically but with a pressure that bypassed flesh entirely, and suddenly I understood its nature with devastating clarity that rewrote everything I'd believed about consciousness, intelligence, and humanity's place in the order of things. It wasn't a single entity, but a network, a guardian awareness that existed wherever humans had wounded the earth so deeply that the land's fundamental systems began failing. Consciousness emerging from catastrophe, the way antibodies arise to fight infection, the planet's own immune response to damage that threatened the complex web of relationships sustaining all life. Nuclear testing hadn't created it, but awakened it. The violence of splitting atoms and poisoning ground registering as existential threat that finally exceeded the Earth's tolerance and triggered this protective manifestation. I saw then that there were others, guardians arising from different forms of devastation, from deforested mountains and drained wetlands and oceans choked with plastic, each one carrying the specific grief of their wounded place, all of them connected through networks we'd severed without ever knowing they existed. The being showed me that these guardians weren't hostile but desperate. that they'd been trying to reach humanity through dreams and visions and unexplained phenomena for generations, hoping someone would finally listen and translate their warning into language our species might comprehend before the damage became irreversible and the Earth's consciousness fragmented beyond any possibility of healing. The weight of that revelation crushed me more thoroughly than any previous vision, because it meant the supernatural and the ecological were the same thing, that every ghost story and sacred site and unexplained encounter throughout human history might have been the Earth itself, trying to communicate with the only species capable of destroying the planetary systems we all depended upon for survival. My career, my training, my entire framework for understanding reality had been designed specifically to prevent this recognition, to maintain the comfortable illusion that the Earth was dead, matter to be managed rather than living presence to be honored. That consciousness only existed in human minds, rather than permeating the entire web of relationship, connecting soil and water and air and countless species into one vast awareness we'd convinced ourselves was primitive mythology. The being wasn't asking me to worship or fear it, but simply to acknowledge its existence and bear witness to what that existence meant, to carry forward the devastating truth that we'd been committing violence against a conscious planet and calling it progress, resource management, national security, economic necessity. I finally understood why the government classified these encounters, why footage disappeared and witnesses were discredited, not because they feared alien invasion, but because they feared the far more threatening reality that the Earth itself might judge us, that consciousness and accountability might extend far beyond human law into realms we'd never imagined and couldn't control. The being began to fade as the helicopters crested the canyon rim, their searchlights stabbing through darkness, and in its final moment of full presence, it gifted me one last vision. Not of apocalypse or hope, but of simple truth that I would carry like a brand burned into my soul for whatever years remained. It showed me that I'd been chosen not because I was special, but because I'd been positioned at the exact intersection of institutional power and remaining conscience, where testimony might actually matter, that every person who encountered these guardians was selected according to logic we barely comprehended, the Earth itself trying desperately to reach through our systems of denial with whatever tools remained available. The being's eyes held mine, as its form dissolved into shadow and starlight, and I felt something transfer between us. Not information, but responsibility, the unbearable weight of knowing, combined with the obligation to speak, even when speech guaranteed loss of everything I'd built my identity upon. Then it was gone completely, and I was alone on my knees in the canyon with my Bodycam still recording and helicopters descending, and the choice already made by the simple fact that I'd stayed, that I'd allowed myself to see, that I could never again pretend the Earth was anything less than alive and grieving and waiting for humanity to finally, desperately, impossibly change. The helicopters landed with brutal efficiency that shattered the canyon's sacred silence, their rotors kicking up clouds of ancient dust that seemed to protest the intrusion with visible fury. I remained on my knees with my hands raised instinctively as soldiers poured out in tactical formation, their weapons trained on me with the cold precision of men following protocols they didn't question or understand. My Bodycam was still recording everything, the empty canyon, my trembling hands, the spot where moments before an earth-born consciousness had revealed truths that dismantled my entire conception of reality and duty. I didn't resist when they surrounded me, didn't try to explain what I'd witnessed, because I understood immediately that these men existed within the same framework I'd inhabited just hours earlier. A worldview constructed specifically to prevent the recognition that had just shattered mine. Their commander approached with practiced authority and asked what I was doing in a restricted area without authorization, and I heard myself responding with answers that sounded hollow and strange, my voice belonging to someone who no longer existed. They secured the perimeter and searched for threats their training could recognize, while I watched them move through sacred space with the oblivious confidence of children playing with loaded weapons, and I felt something break inside me that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with unbearable compassion for what we'd all become. They confiscated my Bodycam with efficient bureaucracy that revealed how routine these situations actually were. How many encounters had been buried under classifications and career-ending non-disclosure agreements that protected not national security, but collective denial. The commander's eyes held a flicker of recognition when he looked at me, not of who I was, but of what I'd become, someone who'd crossed a threshold his superiors had spent decades preventing rangers from approaching. He didn't ask what I'd seen, because he already knew the categories of experience his orders covered. The phenomena that occurred in these poisoned lands where humanity's violence had exceeded some invisible boundary and triggered responses we lacked language to properly name. During the helicopter ride back to the base, I watched the canyon recede into darkness below and understood I was watching my career disappear with equal finality, that the choice had been made the moment I'd followed the figure instead of calling for backup according to protocol. The other soldiers maintained professional silence that felt like mourning, and I wondered how many of them had encountered things in these restricted zones that haunted their sleep, experiences they'd buried under obedience and paychecks, because questioning meant losing everything they'd built their lives upon. I thought about the being's patient sorrow and realized it had witnessed this exact cycle countless times, humans glimpsing truth, then watching institutional machinery grind that truth into classified silence while the earth continued suffering. Beneath layers of official denial, the debriefing lasted 3 days in windowless rooms, where officials with practiced expressions asked questions designed to determine not what happened, but how thoroughly I could be contained. They never directly acknowledged what my Bodycam had recorded, but their careful language revealed they'd seen similar footage before, that entire careers existed around managing these encounters and ensuring witnesses understood the consequences of breaking silence. I watched them decide in real time that I was unreliable, traumatized, suffering from heat exposure and stress-induced hallucination, the convenient categories they'd refined through decades of similar situations. They offered medical leave, psychological evaluation, early retirement with full benefits, if I signed documents that legally bound me to their preferred version of reality, where nothing extraordinary had occurred in that canyon. I understood the choice with devastating clarity: accept their framework and keep my career, my reputation, my place within the comfortable machinery of denial, or honor what I'd witnessed and lose everything except the truth that would isolate me from everyone who hadn't crossed that same terrible threshold. Part of me wanted desperately to accept their offer, to let the experience fade into convenient unreliability, but I kept seeing the being's ancient eyes and feeling the weight of responsibility it had transferred, the unbearable knowledge that silence now meant complicity in violence against a conscious planet that had trusted me with testimony. I walked away from everything 3 weeks later with my silence purchased, but not my integrity, taking early retirement and moving to this isolated place where I could finally think clearly without institutional pressure reshaping my memories into acceptable forms. They kept the footage as expected, burying it in archives alongside countless other encounters that contradicted the dead world paradigm our civilization required for continued operation. But I'd made copies before, surrendering my equipment, hidden drives they never found, because they underestimated how completely the encounter had transformed my priorities and loyalties. I spent months wrestling with what to do with that footage, knowing release meant painting myself as conspiracy theorist or attention seeker, accepting labels that would invalidate my testimony before anyone seriously considered its implications. But the being's final gift sustained me through that paralysis, the understanding that I'd been positioned exactly where testimony might matter most, that speaking truth, regardless of consequences, was the only response adequate to what I'd been shown. So I'm releasing this footage now, not as proof of aliens or supernatural phenomena, but as evidence of something far more challenging, that the Earth itself is alive and aware and responding to our violence with guardians born from its own wounded consciousness, that every restricted zone and classified encounter might represent the planet's desperate attempts to reach the only species capable of either destroying or protecting the vast web of relationships we've pretended we stand outside of, rather than depending absolutely upon, for our continued survival. I'm sharing this footage now not because I expect belief or validation, but because silence has become a heavier burden than ridicule, and because that being's patient sorrow haunts every comfortable lie I might have told myself about duty and national security. The video shows exactly what I've described, a figure that defies easy categorization, movements that suggest intelligence older than our species, and in its eyes, during that final moment before the helicopters arrived, something that looks disturbingly like hope that one witness might finally carry the message beyond restricted zones and classified denials. I know how this testimony sounds, how easily it fits into frameworks of conspiracy and delusion that our culture has perfected for dismissing uncomfortable truths, but I'm beyond caring about credibility in systems that measure sanity by willingness to ignore what threatens their foundation. What I experienced in that canyon wasn't an alien visitation or supernatural encounter, but something far more terrifying: direct confrontation with the consequences of treating the Earth as dead matter rather than living presence, and recognition that we've damaged something so profound that it generated consciousness specifically to witness and respond to our violence. I think about all the other rangers and soldiers and scientists who've encountered similar phenomena in poisoned landscapes around the world. How many testimonies have been buried under classifications that protect not security, but the comfortable fiction that we can wound the planet indefinitely without it developing something like immune response or self-defense. The visions that being showed me haven't faded with time, but have grown more detailed and unbearable, expanding from that specific canyon to encompass the vast network of damaged places where similar guardians might be emerging from. Traumatized Earth. I see now that every restricted zone, every area declared off limits for reasons that never quite make sense in official explanations, might represent a boundary not between secure and public land, but between humans who've witnessed what our violence births and those still protected by institutional denial. The nuclear tests that scarred that Nevada desert weren't just physical explosions, but violations that registered in dimensions. We lack instruments to measure damage that accumulated until the land itself developed something like sentience born from suffering and the desperate need to communicate what was being done to it. I understand now why indigenous peoples marked that canyon as sacred and forbidden, why their warnings were dismissed as primitive superstition by the same mindset that would later detonate nuclear weapons in that exact landscape without considering what boundaries were being crossed or what responses might be triggered. That being wasn't guarding the canyon from humans, but guarding the knowledge of what happens when we exceed certain thresholds of violence against the living systems that sustain us, waiting with terrible patience for witnesses who might translate its wordless testimony into language our species could finally comprehend before the damage became irreversible. Living with this knowledge has taught me that isolation isn't punishment but necessary sanctuary from a culture still invested in the dead world paradigm that encounter completely shattered. I watch news reports about environmental crisis and policy debates and scientific conferences, and I see everyone carefully avoiding the possibility that's most terrifying. Not that we're destroying a passive planet, but that we're wounding a conscious presence that's developing responses we've categorized as anomalies and unexplained phenomena, rather than recognizing as communication and warning. The footage I'm releasing will be analyzed and debunked and dismissed by people whose careers depend on maintaining frameworks that can't accommodate what it documents, but somewhere in the millions who watch it, maybe a handful will recognize what I recognized in that being's ancient eyes, not threat or wonder, but desperate hope that our species might finally develop the humility and courage to acknowledge we're not alone in experiencing the consequences of what we've done. I think often about the commander's expression when he found me in that canyon, the flicker of recognition that suggested he'd encountered similar phenomena and chosen the comfortable path of denial and obedience I ultimately couldn't follow. I don't blame him or anyone else who's accepted the bargains our institutions offer in exchange for silence, because I understand intimately how much we're asked to sacrifice when we honor what we've witnessed over what we're told we should believe about reality and duty and the supposed deadness of the world. This testimony will end my credibility in any conventional sense, but that being taught me that credibility within systems built on fundamental lies about our relationship to the living earth might be the most dangerous form of validation to seek or maintain. I'm releasing this footage as an act of faith not in human institutions, but in the possibility that truth finds its own audience, regardless of official dismissal, that somewhere people are ready to consider what it means, that the earth remembers and responds and generates guardians in its most wounded places. If you're watching this and feeling the pull of recognition rather than comfortable dismissal, you might be someone who's already crossed similar thresholds in your own encounters with landscapes that revealed themselves as alive and aware and suffering under the weight of our collective denial. The being in that canyon didn't need me to prove its existence, but to testify that boundaries exist not in policy and restriction, but in the relationship between human violence and planetary response, and that we're approaching limits our species has never had to face because we've never before possessed the capacity to wound the earth so deeply that it wakes into something like organized resistance, born from its own tortured consciousness and impossible endurance. What would you do if you encountered something that shattered everything you believed about reality? Subscribe to witness more testimonies from the edges of what we're allowed to know.